Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and this is the Right to Read initiative, a place where we're sharing information about best practices for teaching reading so that all of our students have the opportunity to learn how to read. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Nathaniel Joseph from Pedagogy Non-Grata, and today he's going to take us through meta-analyses about phonemic awareness instruction. And I think this is a really important area to address to see what the research says, because there's been a lot of discussions on social media recently about what we should do, what we shouldn't do. And I think there's a lot of misinterpretations of the research. So let's dive in.
This is such a hot topic in the science of reading community. So I really want to say that I'd like to approach this with humility, because I don't think the science is as developed as we might think. The science is really developed in one very specific way, and I'll talk about that in a second. But when we start to talk about the nuance of the issues, we're often relying on a smaller and smaller number of studies. And if the audience probably knows by this point, if they've seen me at any point in the past, that I'm all about meta-analysis. And meta-analysis is important because it looks at a whole group of studies at once and looks at what the average result of that study is. And that's really important, as I always say, because sometimes we have studies with really high results or really low results that can throw off our interpretation of literature. And it's really important not to look at one individual study. And I'll give a personal example of this. There was a study that came up very recently on reading recovery that showed really terrible results, and everyone got really excited. And I really want to tell people it's okay. We don't have to look at just this one study. We can look at all the studies, and all the studies on average show low results. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because there will be at some point where another reading recovery study comes out and it'll have high results. And there will be people being like, look at this study, it disproves the previous one. But that's not how science works. We have to look at what is the average across all of these studies. And within meta-analysis, we can use this tool to tailor our results to more specific understandings of the science. So we can be like, okay, what about studies that were at different grades or different demographics, or that use different phonemic awareness tactics? And this is important because it allows us to give a more nuanced and more specific recommendations according to the science. But one caveat I would like to add to that is, the more nuanced results we look at with meta-analysis, the more likely it is that we're looking at a smaller and smaller subset of studies, and the more likely it is that we have to be those results are less reliable. Actually, then I'm going to be talking a lot about the NRP meta-analysis today, because it had a lot of really specific recommendations, which is great. But if you look, the NRP actually didn't have that many phonemic awareness studies total. So as we get into more and more specific recommendations, we're basing our interpretation of the science off of less and less data. And that's not a bad thing. It just means that we have to temper our confidences. And realistically, in science, we should always be thinking in terms of degrees of probability. Personally, I was just talking to Dr. Garforth about this off air. I have this pet peeve where if we're too specific about something when we're talking about it from a scientific perspective. So, and sometimes I like to differentiate when I talk about a subject. Am I talking about it as in, like, what do I personally believe? What is my personal experience? Or what does the science say? Because I'm more willing to make personal recommendations based off my personal experiences than I am based off the science, because I can have more nuance but it's less likely that I'm right if I'm talking about it based off my personal experience, because I don't have proof that I can validate what I'm saying. And I just want people to keep that in mind as I talk about this debate today, because we've had some really big scholars discussing this very recently. Dr. Erie's been discussing it, Dr. Timothy Shanahan, Dr. Kilpatrick Harris, and all of these people are giants in this field. And they are all very bright, very well. They have a very strong understanding of the scientific literature. And they all very much care about the science of reading. And they don't all agree with each other about their interpretations of literature. And while they were having a debate that was of an academic quality, I noticed a lot of people having their own debates on social media, and people got very heated about it. And I just want to point out that the scholars didn't get heated. And that, I think, is because they understand that we always have to be thinking in terms of degrees of probability. So there's always a chance you're wrong in science, and you have to be open to that. So as I go through this today, I just want to give that caveat that this is my interpretation of the scientific data as it stands. and it's not necessarily going to be correct in the future, that science is an ever evolving point. And this, I think, causes confusion for the general public. And I'm sorry for this long diatribe, but where people think that, science changes. Science doesn't change. Science evolves as we get a better understanding of a topic, because we could have 3 studies on a topic today and they could all have very different results. And we could not really have a strong understanding of what we think the correct interpretation is. And we could get 10 more studies next month that paint a much more clear picture. So whenever I speak to these subjects, I'm always speaking of my interpretation of my current understanding of the scientific literature, but the scientific literature is ever evolving. And there's always the potential to miss a study. So that being said, I want to first talk about the impact of phonemic awareness instruction in general. And I
think we should first talk about the difference between phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, just so that listeners understand that we're talking about a very specific level of phonological awareness in this,
Sure.
and not phonological awareness as a whole. So
Okay. You go, Dr. Garforth.
Okay. Phonological awareness has to do with an awareness of the sounds within language, and it's a big umbrella term. So you have word awareness, you have syllable awareness, you have onset rhyme, RIME awareness, and that is the onset is the consonant sound or clusters before the vowel sound in a syllable, and the vowel sound and any additional consonant sounds at the end of the syllable. There's also being able to recognize words that rhyme RHYME. So do come and some rhyme? Do gal and pal rhyme? There's also being awareness of alliteration and those, first sounds being the same. Now, those are all part of phonological awareness, but they're not part of phonemic awareness. Phonemic awareness has to do with the individual speech sounds in spoken language. And those are things like t, p, b, s. And they're very crisp units that are more difficult for students to understand because they're more abstract. And while there's an unconscious awareness of phonemic awareness, when you can understand spoken language, because you can hear the difference between pat and pet and not struggle with it, it's not necessarily that you can discriminate between the phonemes or tell the difference when they're when they're segmented and taken apart. It's also a very important thing for educators to understand, because when we have a better understanding of the phonemes within the English language and how they are pronounced, it can help us understand students' errors, especially when it comes to spelling.
Yeah, I'm glad that you tackled that, because as soon as you asked me that, I was like, oh, you know what? Dr. Garforth is actually the person who first explained this to me. So I better get her to explain this to the audience. I just personally, in my own writing about this topic, I've used Dr. Timothy Shanahan's definition of phonemic awareness, which off the top of my head, I believe he states it as the ability to identify and manipulate phonemes within words. But I think oftentimes with phonemic awareness instruction, we're often talking about manipulating those sounds so that students can get a better idea of how words can be broken down and decoded and encoded, which is, spelling a word based off of phonemes. So one of the things I want to talk about today is that within this umbrella of the science of reading debate and the reading wars debate, obviously phonics has gotten the most attention, and it deserves it, because I think it can be, in some senses, it's probably the most important element of early reading instruction. But the meta-analysis literature in general actually shows a higher result for teaching phonemic awareness than for teaching phonics, which could suggest it is potentially more important in some ways, in some senses. And I actually think phonics is more foundational in the sense that it can be used for longer. But we see, I think, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail, a very specific use for phonemic awareness. So these are, to be clear, the meta-analyses that have been done on the topic of phonemic awareness. And you can see that we have a mean effect size of 0.74, whereas the mean effect size for phonics studies done is 0.55. And speaking off the top of my head now, if we correct for outliers, it's around 0.45. So you can see a very strong effect for teaching phonemic awareness in general. That being said, we see that effect is only within a limited set of circumstances, more so than even phonics. So I wanted to talk about what those are. And I think the NRP meta-analysis is really great for looking at this because it really broke down the information over a large variety of outcomes, and it can help us to parse out what should be our best recommendation for teaching phonemic awareness as of right now. So they actually broke it down according to 3 types of outcomes. First off, phonemic awareness outcomes, spelling outcomes, and reading outcomes. So these are the outcomes you see on the graph right now are the impact of teaching phonemic awareness on phonemic awareness ability for students. So it's important, I think, to put the caveat that this is the most far removed skill from reading that we're going to be looking at. And ultimately, I would argue that phonemic awareness is sort of a pre-reading skill. It's something that we want them to be able to apply.
It definitely is. And if we look developmentally, it doesn't begin to typically develop at a level before we reach about 4 or 5 years old. So when we look at this effect size and the results, we're seeing that huge, big jump for the effect size in the pre-K. And that's because this is just the age where this skill is starting to beginning to develop in the vast majority of students, right? So the explicit instruction is the perfect timing for this, right? And as you get further down into the higher grades, then it lessens. But by that point, the difference between pre and post test isn't going to be the same because you're not testing someone at the beginning of their development that hasn't developed this skill to someone that has.
Yeah, 100%. And we see this consistently across all the outcomes, that pre-K consistently has much higher results than any other group for phonemic awareness instruction, which makes me think, one of our recommendations should be that phonemic awareness should absolutely be taught in pre-K and focused on in pre-K. Whereas I think we should be slowly lowering that amount of instruction over time. I think and I'll make this argument as we go through, but I think we still see a strong benefit in kindergarten. And then we start to see diminishing returns. I mean, we see diminishing returns the second students leave pre-K, but we still see high outcomes in kindergarten and moderate outcomes in grade 1. So I think that those should be, we should have a lot of phonemic awareness instruction in pre-K, still quite a bit in kindergarten, and then starting to really lower that amount of phonemic awareness instruction in grade 1. That's my personal interpretation of the data. And as you can see in this chart, like pre-K is just off the chart. Like seeing an effect size of 2.37 is just massive. It's so big, you almost want to call it an outlier, except we consistently see these really high results for pre-K for phonemic awareness instruction across the data. So I think it's important to identify that. Another really important thing I want to point out was the amount of time spent on it. We see 5 to 9 hours of instruction showed the highest results comparatively to 20 plus hours of instruction. So 20 plus hours instruction showed diminishing returns in comparison to 5 hours of instruction. Now, remember, effect sizes are calculated in comparison to a control group. So that it doesn't actually mean that the group that had 20 hours plus of instruction learned less. It's just that learning was less efficient, so that there was less of a competitive advantage to a control group of teaching phonemic awareness. And this is something we also see consistently across the data, that we seem to get the highest bang for our buck in a very short period of time. Whereas actually for phonics, we seem to see a much longer duration of time before we get that diminishing returns. And my personal interpretation of that is that phonemic awareness can be more beneficial in phonics, but it is best done in probably relatively small doses in, say, comparison to phonics and in very early grades. One of the things that the NRP really looks at was how many skills were taught. So for phonemic awareness, teaching only one skill at a time had the best results, but overall, we saw something different, and I'll talk about that a little later. I think it's important to notice that at-risk learners in general showed really high results for phonemic awareness outcomes by being taught phonemic awareness. Another thing I really want to harp on is the fact that we had the best results across in small group instruction. And this is something we see across the literature, which leads me to believe that that doesn't necessarily that phonemic awareness should be taught by like an interventionist teacher in another classroom, but maybe rather than having your whole class of pre-K doing their phonemic awareness all at once in a group instruction setting, maybe doing some of that as sort of like instead of reading groups in pre-K, because I know that was something that Balanced Literacy tried to push, but I think it makes more sense to do phonemic awareness instruction in your literacy groups, whatever you want to call them, or your small group time in pre-K, than it does say giving them a leveled book when they can't identify the letters in the book. Before I move on to reading outcomes, do you have anything to add to that or ask about, Dr. Garforth?
I think it might be important to talk about the different skills that can be worked on in phonemic awareness, because it's not just meaning any one of the various skills teaching in phonemic awareness. There is a hierarchy to them. And when we look at it, blending phonemes together, so going from k, at to cat is, I think it's the highest. And segmenting, which is going from cat to k, at, saying the phonemes individually, is the second highest. Now, there are other skills, and these are the skills that we see a lot of the debate occurring with, and that's the manipulation of the phonemes, addition, subtracting. So if I say cat without the k, and then getting the student to say at, that's more of an advanced phonemic awareness skill. Or change the k to a p, so they'd say pat. These are skills that, if we're teaching them in the amount of time that we spend teaching them, is not going to have those same returns. And I think that's where we're seeing the results, because once we can get it so students can blend the phonemes together, that's what we're asking them to do when they are sounding words out.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's reading and spelling.
Yeah. And this is something I talk about in my first book, Scientific Principles of Teaching. It's just, we want our instruction to be specific to what we're looking for. So blending is a far more specific skill to reading ability than deletion, having the students delete a sound from the word. So it does make sense. We see higher returns for blending and segmenting than for deletion. Although I will say that the NRP meta-analysis showed higher results for blending and segmenting, but it still showed significant results for deletion. The way I interpret that personally is that we should spend more time on blending and segmenting than say deletion.
And there are students that do need that advanced phonemic awareness activities to get to a level of understanding. And those are typically the students that do have a language-based learning disability and not necessarily needed for the whole classroom.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to talk about specifically that subject a little bit on forward. So this is the reading outcomes from the NRP meta-analysis. Again, we see preschool very high results. We see higher results for a little bit more time of instruction. And this actually makes sense. I mean, obviously, teaching phonemic awareness is going to increase phonemic awareness outcomes more than reading outcomes, because it's more specific to the assessment. But we still see a relatively short period of time having higher results. Oh, I've gone ahead. Compared, say, to 20 hours plus of instruction, the average for study showed an effect was a 0.31 versus 0.86 for 10 to 18 hours. That's very significant difference. I think that's far more of a statistical margin of error. Again, we see the best results for small groups. We see really strong results for at-risk readers. And here we saw the highest outcomes for two skills being taught at the same time rather than only one skill being taught at the same time. I think I will point out that we saw comprehension towards the bottom. And I think this actually makes sense. When you think about it, like the skill of phonemic awareness really has nothing to do with comprehension. It might indirectly be helping reading skills, or you could even argue somewhat directly helping reading skills because it makes decoding easier. but it's not necessarily going to help them understand the text better in itself, but it's a building block so we can make better readers. Because if students can read words, it's easier for them to understand what the text is about. Do you have any comment about this before I?
Well, I think that's very important to understand. And, when we look at some of the more advanced statistical manners and looking for factors and predictability and that sort of thing, this is where there's that overlap, and it's looking at the individual variance that is being accounted for. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And I think it's important to realize the impact of phonemic awareness on reading instruction, especially when we look at phonics, because phonics is the explicit teaching of the relationships between phonemes and graphemes, which are the letters and their sounds. So if you can't hear or discriminate the difference between sounds, you're going to struggle to identify which letter to associate with. But as you increase that ability to hear the sounds in words, you're going to be able to map that relationship between the sound to the letter. And if we look deeper at the neuroscience side of things for reading, we're seeing that there is the phonological processor that's partly responsible for reading. I think that's a little bit deeper than we need to go in this discussion, but there is a significant part of the phonology that we need to understand.
Yeah, I think you put that really eloquently. And I think there's a sort of a natural scaffolding to reading instruction that I often think gets missed. And when I advocate for this natural scaffolding, sometimes I think people misinterpret me to say we should only teach one of these skills at a time. I think it's more, what do we emphasize at what grade? So when I see pre-K, I think the biggest emphasis should be on letter recognition and phonemic awareness. That's my interpretation of the literature. Whereas, grade 1, grade 2, I think the biggest emphasis should be on phonics. And then I think grade 3, probably to grade 5, we should have the biggest influence on fluency. But this is not to say that we shouldn't be teaching some level of all of these things all at once. It's just, how much do we emphasize? And obviously some things should be phased out, like phonemic awareness. I don't think you should be teaching in a grade 8 classroom.
No, I was going to say in a high school general education classroom, you're not going to be wanting to practice these skills of deletion and replacement. I mean, it might be fun, working on
it can be actually a really fun thing to do with kids.
And, it can be an exercise, but I wouldn't try and get these students to master it, because it's not going to impact what you can do. Now, if you're working as an interventionist or a small group in special education, this could be an underlying problem that the student does have. So I do think it's very important to include a phonological and phonemic awareness screener when you're working with students who are struggling with reading, because you need to identify the lowest skill that they're struggling with in order for them to improve.
Yeah, I 100% agree with this. I sometimes see science looking at what is best for dyslexic students. And I think it's important to look at this, but I still don't think we should, if you have, let's say you're a tutor or an intervention teacher and you're working with a dyslexic student, I don't think you should immediately go to, Pedagogy Non-Grata.com or ScienceTeaching.com, see what the best effect sizes are for programs or for things for teaching dyslexic students, because you're trying to match your instruction to the specific needs of those students. So that's why I think it's more important to focus on your assessment data. What does your assessment show? What is the deficits? So if you have a grade 5 student who's diagnosed with dyslexia and they're showing deficits in phonemic awareness, I absolutely think you should be teaching the phonemic awareness. But I don't think you should look at a study like this and say, oh, look, really high results for phonemic awareness. Every dyslexic student needs phonemic awareness. You might have a diagnosed dyslexic student who's reading at a grade 6 level because they've already had intense instruction, or they have found ways to adapt. I don't think your go-to is necessarily going to be phonemic awareness instruction for that student. And I think it's really important to keep that when you're doing an intervention model. I think it's really important to keep the individual student in your mind and not try to just apply like an umbrella strategy across the board. One thing I really wanted to point out real quick, actually, before we moved on, is this. Look at the very bottom of this graph. So the thing that had the lowest impact of all these study variables was teaching 3 or more phonemic awareness skills at once. Whereas if we taught 2 at the same time, we see 0.79, which, by the way, the benchmark for whether or not something has a high impact is supposed to be 0.79. Although I would argue personally that in reading, it should probably be viewed as lower because we tend to see lower results in reading studies on average.
Well, and typically, I mean, I haven't read the NPR report recently, but typically we're looking at the blending and segmenting of phonemes being those 2 strategies, and then adding the manipulation in when you're doing 3 or more.
Yeah. The NRP meta-analysis is like 400 pages long. I've had to go through it over and over again because I've cited it so many times, but every time I realize I have to go back and read it again because if I miss something or I want to find a specific piece of information, I die a little inside because it's so long. Anyways, this is the results for spelling from the NRP meta-analysis. So right at the top here, we see 5 to 9 hours instruction having the biggest impact. So this is, I think, important to remember that we see the biggest impact for phonemic awareness outcomes with shorter periods of instruction. Now, generally speaking, one criticism of this specific aspect by Dr. Kilpatrick Harris is that most of the studies on phonemic awareness in the NRP meta-analysis are not on dyslexic students. So that has been a criticism of that, applying that too broadly. But for the average class, like, I don't think it makes sense to be doing, hours and hours and hours on a weekly basis of phonemic awareness instruction. Personally, I think it makes sense to be doing, 15, 20 minutes a day with your pre-K class, maybe 5-10 minutes a day with your kindergarten class, maybe 5 minutes a day with your grade 1 class, and maybe as needed with your grade 2s and moving forward. Now, that's a very unspecific recommendation because it's based off of both looking at the data and my personal experience, but
also implicit instruction that happens throughout the day.
Yeah.
And you'll see experienced teachers saying, let's go get our K-O-T. And in that instant, they're not actually doing a phonemic awareness lesson, but they're getting the students to blend the word, and that practice throughout the day. And, highlighting some of the segments. So looking at alliteration in your reading, and bringing up those in the context of other lessons is not going to cause any harm.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think this is something that gets lost because sometimes when you're saying, what you're really saying is, I don't want to see this explicitly and systematically taught at this grade because the science doesn't seem to support doing that. Which, the argument of balanced literacy advocates was always that, well, we'll teach phonics implicitly, unsystematically, because not every kid needs phonics, which I don't think is true, actually. But it's sort of like, oh, as needed. And it's not to say that no instruction can be as needed. There's always going to be little things. Like, I love teachable moments when a kid asks me a question. I'm a bigger proponent of teaching this systematically and explicitly overall. But like, I have grade 8s, and sometimes they'll ask me about a word and a regular spelling. Like Dr. Pete Bowers rings in my head. I'm like, let's do a little bit of structured word inquiry. That's not because I'm personally doing a systematic approach to structured word inquiry. But if a kid has like an interesting question like that, I think it's great. Take a minute, stop, go look up the history of that word and the why it's spelled the way it is. And it can be a nice moment for the kid to help remember the spelling of that word.
Well, and I think when we come, especially to the spelling outcomes, so the slide that we're on right now, and if you are a teacher who does use spelling tests, and I'm not advocating for them or saying that you shouldn't, I'm just saying that if they are something that you use in your classroom and you notice that there are sounds being left out in the words, well, that's when you can, as a class, talk about it. So, okay, guys, let's take a minute and break it down into its individual speech sounds. And a word that I often find children leaving out syllables is library, because a lot of kids say library, right? And then it's talking about their articulation and how the English language is a morphophonemic language, and that we see that we need to pay attention to the number of phonemes in a word when we're spelling it. And yes, morphemes do come into play. But if we're not having at least one letter representing each sound in the word, we're missing some.
Yeah, I agree completely, 100%. A couple of things I'm going to highlight just from this information here that you can see on the screen. Again, we see high outcomes for small groups, higher outcomes for lower grade students. We see low outcomes for 3 or more phonemic awareness skills taught for grade 2 and beyond, for 20 plus hours of instruction. And one that we'll talk about a little more in a second that I've kind of left off out of the discussion for now is letters not being manipulated. Whereas if we look at letters being manipulated, we see higher outcomes. This is something we saw in general throughout, and that was just phonemic awareness seems to, at least in the NRP meta-analysis, seem to show higher outcomes when students were taught letters at the same time, not having taught phonemic awareness completely separately. Which has been one of the more intensively debated parts about phonemic awareness instruction is, do we teach it without letters or with letters? And I've heard arguments on both sides qualitatively. And actually, if I'm being honest, I like both the argument for teaching without letters and against. The argument I've seen for teaching it with letters is that it's more specific to reading instruction, because ultimately we want students to use phonemic awareness to decode and encode words. That's logical. And the argument against it I've seen is that, well, it's a more foundational skill to teach the phonemic awareness, the sounds, before they learn letters, because that's a more natural process. And I think that actually also makes sense. But sometimes we don't have to rely on the qualitative data or hypothesis. We can look at what does the meta-analysis literature show. And it's entirely possible that these results are wrong and that more studies will come out and disprove this theory in the future. But my interpretation of the data so far is that we seem to have higher results for teaching phonemic awareness with letters, not without letters.
I think it also, personally,
Yeah.
I think that it depends when you're talking about too. If you're talking about those 3 and 4-year-olds that are just figuring out the sounds and letters are still squiggles and mean nothing to them, doing phonological and phonemic awareness activities without letters is fine. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that. And if you're working with a student that has a severe learning disability and a severe deficit in phonological awareness, you're just adding too much for the cognitive load.
Yeah, I've heard Kilpatrick make the same argument as you there.
But when you're doing whole group classroom instruction and your students know the alphabet, I think that it's definitely appropriate to include that. So maybe the first few weeks or first month and a half in kindergarten, you may not have that same explicit instruction with the phonemic awareness, including the letters off the bat, while you're still working on the letters and the sounds. And, there's so much diversity between classrooms. I don't think it's fair to have a blanket statement that applies for all classrooms too.
Yeah. One counter argument to what you just said is I think that one of the possible benefits that we might be seeing within the literature is that by teaching letters at the same time, they're learning letter recognition, and they're kind of learning phonics and phonemic awareness at the same time. Inherently, when we teach phonemic awareness with letters, I think it's almost slightly hard to distinguish between phonics training between phonemic awareness and that includes letters. I think there's some similarity there. But again, like my personal thing is I just default to what the meta-analysis shows currently. But I think there's arguments as you put it against, and I think it's okay to have a nuanced position to that. I don't think we need to have a reading wars over whether or not letters need to be.
And I think it comes down to looking at the data for your classroom.
Yeah.
Right. I'm a big advocate on screening students, especially in the primary grades, to get an understanding of where your students are and letting that data make the decisions for you for where to focus your instruction.
Yeah. So this last is the last I have on the NRP meta-analysis. And I've taken an average across the three outcomes and conducted like my own secondary meta-analysis of the NRP because they only leave it as one outcome. So this is an average across all three outcomes. So we see the highest overall impact is for pre-K for phonemic awareness. We see the highest impact is for 5 to 9 hours of instruction and for small group instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see this diminishing return really clearly, I think, more easily when we take this overall average, because we have pre-K has the highest, then kindergarten, then grade 1, and then grade 2. I would call that a very linear relationship. And similarly, we see the highest impact for 5 to 9 hours of instruction, then 10 to 18, and then all the way at the bottom, we have 20 hours plus instruction showing the lowest. So again, that's a fairly linear relationship. I would say that suggests that although phonemic awareness might be in the early grades more important than phonics, which I feel like it's a very extreme statement to say, but there is evidence to that. That the return of that investment is very quickly diminishing, and that it's probably important not to overkill phonemic awareness instruction, which I think there is some debate over in the community of the science reading community, and I want to get into that debate a little if we have time for your audience.
Yes, of course.
Do you have any final thoughts over just the general outcomes from the NRP?
No, I mean, I think it's clear that some degree of phonemic awareness instruction is essential to have in our curriculum.
100%.
And, like anything, there isn't a cut and paste model that's going to work for every classroom. Mm-hmm. So understanding your comfort level with it. And I think that's where a lot of the programs have been getting some flack, is because, there are programs out there that have, 35 weeks of daily scripted lessons on this. And for a teacher that is new to phonemic awareness instruction and phonological awareness instruction, that may be what they need to develop their own skills in phonemic and phonological awareness, because it is a topic that has been left out of a lot of teacher education curriculums. So having that resource can be very helpful for them. Now, someone who's more familiar with this topic area and is comfortable creating the resources and the activities on their own may be able to do that, no problem. But I don't think we can say that all things are bad. And taking that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that approach from the different programs available. And I know there are new additions coming out for many of these programs that have been criticized recently.
Yeah, it's funny. I was really against phonics programs, and I did this my own meta-analysis. It's not peer reviewed, but it was quite extensive on phonics programs, and I changed my mind after doing that, and it was because I saw such a degree of difference between some phonics programs and others. It was very clear that some phonics programs have great results and some have terrible results, and I didn't have a really clear explanation as to why that was. And then I thought that sort of it diminishes the argument against teachers just going out and teaching their own phonics lessons, because there seems to be some very important, almost intangible factors in the success of that. At least that was my interpretation, because there were programs that looked almost identical to each other to me. And one of them would have a terrible result and one of them had amazing results. And I was left scratching my head being like, I don't know why that is. So I think there is value in just picking up a really strong phonics program that has high results personally. But for phonemic awareness, I actually think when you see that, we see the highest benefit for limited instruction for only 2 skills taught, I personally like the idea better of teachers just learning how to do those phonemic awareness drills and building it into a routine in their classroom better than I like the idea of them going out and being like, I'm going to pick up my 3-year-long scripted program for phonemic awareness instruction. And not to throw any program specifically under the bus, although I'm sure people can think of specific ones that meet the criteria I'm describing.
But again, it's a matter of when you're just starting out and trying to make all the changes that have been recommended in the Ontario Human Rights Commission, Right to Read, Public Inquiry, there's a lot of information in there and a lot of changes that they're being asked from teachers. And I think it's better to have a solid resource to reference and not necessarily use cover to cover than having to spend, the 45 minutes a night to figure everything out and lay it out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. My only point is I wouldn't like take a scripted approach to teaching phonemic awareness, because I don't think the literature shows a clear-cut benefit to that. I don't think it needs to be that extensive, which is a weird thing to say, because I'm always being like, oh, you got to increase your time under instruction. It's got to be systematic. It's got to be explicit. And here on phonemic awareness, I'm like, take it easy, guys. Don't go crazy with it.
I think that's only the case if the individual is strong in phonological awareness and phonemic awareness themselves, and that they can hear a word and break it into its individual phonemes without effort, because this is a skill that we don't want to confuse. And the problem when you're first starting out with phonemic awareness as a reader is that in your head, you see the word spelt and you break it down into the letters. And if you don't have that instantaneous knowledge about the digraphs and the trigraphs and the silent letters, you're going to be doing the as t, h, right? Not
Yeah.
So sometimes it is nice to have that written down beside you. And as I've noticed in, the research studies that I helped with throughout my schooling, there is a lot, and this kind of speaks to what you mentioned about the phonics programs, is a lot comes down to implementation fidelity. And this is something that I found in reading programs and in math programs. So it's one thing to get a one-day professional development on a tool or on a program. And it's a different thing to taking that and using it how it's been designed to be used in your classroom. And this is why we see different results from research where facilitators from the university implement it and when it's classroom teachers who are doing it, because if they don't have the support and the scaffolding to implement these new skills, they may not be getting it right and may not be using the program appropriately. And that's why another recommendation in the report that I think is very important is having those literacy coaches within the schools to understand it. So if a teacher's, new to these concepts and these matters of teaching, having that someone helping them along and to run things by is really important.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And I have to resist the urge to go into a study design conversation now, because this fast becoming my favorite topic. The science of reading is one thing. Let's talk about study design. That's cool. Okay. I wanted to, before we end, talk about this debate around advanced phonemic awareness, because that was where we saw a lot of debate over in the last year. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. I saw, I'm going to skip ahead in my slideshow because I think I have a terrible layout, but I saw a couple questions that really popped up in the science reading community and across this debate. And I thought we could try to answer them based on the scientific literature. So the first one is advanced phonemic awareness evidence-based? Should we teach sounds first or letters first? Should we teach PA to older students? Should we teach PA for an extended period of time? And do dyslexic students benefit more from PA? Now, I'm going to throw this out there. We've kind of already answered 3 of these. I'll touch on the first one real quick, and that's, is advanced phonemic awareness evidence-based? And I want to, people have used this as a term to describe deletion and extended phonemic awareness. And it was actually a term originally coined by Dr. Kilpatrick Harris, and he has rescinded the term because he felt like it wasn't being used the way he wanted it to be used. He said he meant it more as a skill, not as a form of instruction. That people took it as a form of instruction, like he meant that the reader could delete sounds, not that you should be teaching them to delete sounds as a form of advanced phonemic awareness instruction. So he's actually rescinded that term and gotten rid of it. So I would not, and we do not have any, to the best of my knowledge, meta-analyses specifically on advanced phonemic awareness, which is really hard to do because there's not one clear definition of it in the science or the scientific literature. On the should we teach sounds first or letters first, you and I have talked about this. It seems that there are some qualitative arguments for teaching sounds first, and I think there are very compelling arguments for it. But in the scientific literature, we seem to see the greatest benefit for teaching letters first. Should we teach phonemic awareness to older students? Obviously, from the NRP meta-analysis, it looks like no. However, Dr. Kilpatrick Harris has argued that the NRP meta-analysis not sufficiently examine the issue of teaching this to older students. And now he cited several studies on this, and I'm going to talk about those studies in a second. This comes back to the question, should we teach it for an extended period of time? The literature clearly says no, but the question that Dr. Kilpatrick Harris asks is, what about dyslexic students? Do they need more phonemic awareness instruction? And again, he cites several studies to this. And again, do dyslexic students specifically benefit from more phonemic awareness? Now, the NRP meta-analysis did not show that they benefit more from phonemic awareness instruction than regular students. But Dr. Kilpatrick Harris, he cites several studies that do have sort of an extended phonemic awareness instruction program. And most of them show quite high effect sizes. So I'm going to bring them up here. These are the studies that he cites that have effect sizes that can be calculated in a fair way. There was one that I had to exclude because it didn't have a control group. But as you can see, we have an average of an effect size of 0.63. That's quite high. And he cites these for showing the benefit for teaching long periods of time of phonemic awareness instruction to specifically identified as dyslexic students. Now, I will say I have a problem with 3 of these studies. 2 of these studies are teaching to, in their control group, they're using a balanced literacy group. So the experiment group is synthetic phonics and phonemic awareness, and they're comparing that to balanced literacy, which I think makes it messy to determine, are these dyslexic students learning because they're getting synthetic phonics, or are they learning because they're getting phonemic awareness? It's really impossible to determine which one is the determining factor there. And then another one of these students is on younger students, which we already know that phonemic awareness benefits. So it's really hard to tell. The only one of these studies that I think is really looking at this issue is the WISE 1999 study, and it looks at teaching extended phonemic awareness to dyslexic students versus teaching only phonics to dyslexic students. And here we see a very large effect size, in my opinion, for reading instruction. So this is a very significant study. However, to quote Dr. Steve Graham, who I recently interviewed, if something isn't science if we don't have replication. So I would say this is real, in my opinion, this is the only study we have looking at that I'm aware of, at least, advanced phonemic awareness instruction. And it does show really good benefits for dyslexic students, but it's one study. So I think we need some more science in this area.
Well, and I think it's important to note that it's very hard to get those very specific studies as far, from a research perspective, because of funding and the logistics of getting sample sizes and ethics. So there is a reason why we don't have necessarily numerous studies to draw on. The other thing that I think is limited, at least in the meta-analysis side of things, is looking at the importance of phonological awareness and phonemic awareness instruction in English as an additional language learners, especially when we're looking at students that their first language may not have that importance on the phonemes, and realizing that, the English language has 20 consonant phonemes and 24 vowel phonemes. Now, that's significantly higher number of vowel phonemes than a lot of other languages. So having that instruction to help the individuals hear the difference between the vowel phonemes and also some of the phonemes that in English are distinct, but in other languages are not. So, for example, the and the are not distinct phonemes in some languages, but they are in English.
Yeah, I've looked at the scientific literature for phonics for ESL students, and we actually typically see way higher results for teaching phonics to ESL students than we do for native speaking English learners. And I think it makes complete sense to say that phonemic awareness instruction would also show the same benefits. I wonder if it would show higher benefits, because if you're coming in not having a sufficient understanding of the phonemes behind the language, it kind of reminds me of you being a pre-K student, in that you're in a similar learning space. And I think it's also it makes sense too that dyslexic students would benefit from phonemic awareness if they're lacking those skills, because a student, let's say if a student is reading at a pre-K level and they're in grade 4, teaching them like a pre-K student, in my opinion, makes more sense than teaching them like a grade 4 student, because their reading level is not that of a grade 4 student. So I think there's a very solid qualitative argument to be made to teach more phonemic awareness to dyslexic students, specifically if we've identified that need, and to ESL students. I just don't think we have that very strongly proven within the scientific literature. But this is, I think, might not necessarily be the fact that the studies aren't demonstrating it. It's just that we don't have enough research. So I think that's where we can say our best guess is, or my personal opinion based on the evidence I have available to me is, rather than being like, well, the science clearly indicates, because we can't really make those strong statements on this topic, in my opinion.
Definitely. Well, thank you again for joining me today, Nathaniel. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I am looking forward to our conversation on morphological awareness next week.
Sounds great. Thank you.